Hello. Welcome once again to this reading and this discussion. We're going to continue in the reading. Some of you who have been following us and listening and participating in the reading, you know that we've been talking about identity and identity empowerment and identity empowerment theology, which involves a self-discovery through a critical study of the scriptures. This presentation is brought to you by Operation Isaiah 58 Biblical Literacy Institute, where we are reading critically and analytically as a righteous act. My name is Dion, and welcome once again. I hope you are enjoying your day and in doing your research and studies, and you're being inspired to study and to research. As students of the Bible, we are admonished to study. The scripture states to study, to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that need not be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. And we know, some of you who have been following this discussion, we know that when you look up the word study in the dictionary, it simply means to spend a devotion of time doing a detailed investigation and analysis of a subject or situation, especially by means of books. So that word study, we've been admonished to do, and that's what we are about here as students of the Hebrew Bible. Now, we're going to start with the section 1, History of Israel Before and After Solomon. This is a reading written by Pastor Thomas Vanda Odimba. The title of the book is The Great Secrets of Israel, Discoveries Among the Bantus of Africa, and the Sacred Meaning of the Song of Solomon, translated according to the African PALAVER. And Pastor Thomas Odimba, he is a brother from the Congo. And he has brought a wealth of information and investigation and research on this topic regarding Israel and the Israelites of the Bible. Now, chapter 3 is going to cover the political life of Joseph. But before we get into that reading, I want to do a little bit of a recap from chapter 1. This is to catch us, just to highlight and catch some of us up to where we are, and just to emphasize some things that have already been said and written in this book. Now, remember on page 14, and those of you who are interested in purchasing the book, reach out to me. You can get the book. It is available. It comes with a DVD, and I highly recommend that everybody have this information so you can share with your friends, your family, and your loved ones. It's very, very important information. But on page 14, under the subtitle, The Territory of Ham in Egypt, Pastor Thomas Odimba directs our attention to the fact that the arbitrary allotment, he states, of the whole of ancient Egypt to the descendants of Ham alone creates confusion in distinguishing between the various people who lived in this powerful state before the arrival of the descendants of Ham, which are Philistines and Canaanites, which are composed of Philistines and Canaanites. Now, this is where he's stating that this is where the confusion is. And, you know, me personally, I often wondered about the different races in Africa. And, you know, we would say things like, what's all the fighting about? What's going on? And I would get the answer, oh, it's tribal, it's tribal warfare going on and whatnot, but I think this information that Pastor Odimba is bringing to our attention helps to clarify a lot of this confusion, that there are two races of Black folk in Africa and in the world, right? Now, to prove what he states to be in fact true, I went online and it's this article that was titled "The Historical Origin of the Egyptians," right? So this is an article that was written in 2013, "The Historical Origin of the Egyptians." Now, this person who wrote this article, this is what they stated. Now it states, according to the Bible, the ancient Egyptians were descended from Ham. Now stop. Now, this person just made a statement. I don't know if you can, reading critically and analytically, do you see what I see? Did you read what I read? Based on what we've gone over already. This person wrote that according to the Bible, the ancient Egyptians were descended from Ham. Okay, so this is here where Pastor Damba says that the arbitrary allotment of the whole of ancient Egypt to the descendants of Ham alone is creating this confusion. And here we have a perfect example of that. This person who's writing, it's insinuating that all of the ancient Egyptians were descended from Ham. And then this person goes on to write, through the line of Mizraim. And then they proceed to quote the scripture from Genesis 10, verse 6. Ham had 4 sons, Cush, Mizraim, Phut, and Canaan. And then they go on to state that the name Mizraim is the original name given for Egypt in the Hebrew Old Testament. So whoever this person is obviously not a scholar, but this is the kind of information that has been plaguing the planet. This type of lies, falsehoods, and misrepresentations of the truth, of the facts. Now, this is what Pastor Odimba, he draws our attention that, the way that we're going to be able to decipher the truth from lies is to look at what the Bible states. And those of us who are students of the Bible, we know that the Bible is a primary source. It's not a secondary source. Some may not know the difference, but primary sources are sources that you use to validate your research. It's a go-to book. It's a go-to book. So the Bible as a primary source, this is how we determine fact from fiction. And remember when Pastor Odimba on page 16, when he says that according to biblical texts, the descendants of Ham were made up of Canaanites, Philistines, Jebusites, Amorites, Hivites, Hittites, to mention only a few. And he quotes Genesis 10, 6 through 20. This person quoted Genesis 10 and only quoted verse 6. Interesting. Now, in this list, one can find Nineveh and Rehoboth, but not Egypt. He goes on to state that Egyptians have often been mistaken for the descendants of Ham by the use of the term Mizraim. Boom. However, the Bible does not say the same thing. So here, he is very well aware of the arguments that are plaguing the planet, attributing the Egyptians to be the descendants of Ham. And I just did this research this morning and found this article and just wanted to confirm and found out that, yes, even, I already knew that that was what that argument was out there, but just to see something on the internet, again, just confirms that, yes, this is in fact what's going on today. Now, Pastor Odimba also, in the section titled Important Information on page 8, he wanted to remind, and I wanted to remind the listening audience of this, that history has been used as a formidable weapon for protection, repression, and defense for the conquering nations. And maybe some of us, may not realize, but we are a colonized or a conquered people. Black folk living in the Black folk of the not just living in the United States, but Black folk of the diaspora. And so we have, a lot of the problems in the issues that we have among ourselves is because we've forgotten that we are a colonized people. And that understanding that the conquering nations have an agenda. And when we forget that, we become, we get Stockholm syndrome. I don't know if some of you are aware of what Stockholm syndrome is, but Stockholm syndrome, maybe I'll pull that up at our next conversation, but Stockholm syndrome is when you begin to sympathize with your captor, the one who took you into captivity, and you've been with them for so long, you forget that they captured you, and you begin to sympathize with their agenda. And so that is, that comes in, because of a lot of different factors. But when we remember that, history is being used by the conquering nations, right? Given that it is very difficult to subdue people who have a profound knowledge of their history. Each nation had a true story that they concealed and legends that they used to protect themselves. And what differentiates, Pastor Odimba goes on to state, what differentiates history from legend is the discrepancy that exists between some historical narratives that have been written by some of the powerful nations that dominated the Hebrews and the Egyptians after David and Solomon, and what the Bible and Egyptian texts say. Okay? So we always go back to the primary source, the Bible, to find out who's lying. And by virtue of these discrepancies, he states that we observe a certain war of ideas between the new overlords, the Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans, and the old ones, namely Egypt and Israel. Now, this is a recap. This is just a recap of chapter 1, the Hamites or descendants of Ham. We'll just make this clear. Now, Pastor Odimba directs our attention to and brings out the fact that Africanists like Sheikh Anta Diop have identified the presence of the Hamite race in Egypt during 3 periods. So let's just get that out. Let's put that on the table. Let's get that straight. This scholar, not just him, but others, have identified when the Hamite race was in Egypt. Okay, now the 3 periods are under the new empire of Ramses, which he's going to go into more in depth as we continue on reading, which was the king who knew not Joseph, mentioned in Exodus chapter 1, verse 8. Under Herodotus, with the domination of the Roman and Greek Empire, and under the Mameluke, with the dominance of the Eastern Roman Empire. Now, according to the scholarship and the research, this is when the Hamites appear on the scene, the historical scene. Now, I want to go in and focus on Herodotus, because Pastor Odimba is going to go in depth into when they came on the scene during the New Empire. But I found some interesting information about Herodotus. Now, Herodotus, now this is the Hamites. Now Herodotus was a Greek, right here. And I got this information online. He was an ancient Greek historian and is the author of the first comprehensive history of Egypt. All right. Now, this is when the Greeks have conquered Egypt, and now they're coming out with their historians. He is nicknamed the father, quote, the father of history, for his writings on various nations. Now we remember, I hate to be redundant, but remember he says that the powerful nations, the conquering nations, that history is used as a weapon by the conquering nations. Okay, and so we're looking at these discrepancies in the war of ideas, and now we're looking at the Greeks. Now, this Greek historian, who's considered, quote, the father of history in Western civilization for his writings on various nations. Around 450 BC, he traveled for several months up to the Nile to the First Cataract, recording his impressions in a highly anecdotal and entertaining manner. Okay, that's questionable here as well. Since he did not read hieroglyphs or speak the Egyptian language, he relied heavily on native interpreters and the temple underlings, whom he mistook for priests. His travel journal on Egypt was written in Greek and published in Athens in 46 BC. Now, this is the interesting part. Although there are many inaccuracies in Herodotus' work, his eyewitness accounts give valuable glimpse into the life in Egypt at the end of the Pharaonic period. So to me, your credibility is shot right here. Many, not just a few inaccuracies, it states many inaccuracies in his work. To me, I mean, you can't get a master's degree with many inaccuracies in the paper that you submit. But he's considered the father of history. You see how and so reading critically and analytically is very important. Now, he couldn't read the hieroglyphs. So this goes back to when Pastor Odimba points out the wanton immorality the Greeks when they were translating the Egyptian texts. That Hermes, the Hellenistic figure, Hermes stated that it was wanton immorality what these Greeks were doing when they were translating the Egyptian, just straight out. It was a violent act. If you look up wanton in the dictionary, it's malicious, spiteful. It's a violent act. And so we see that very clearly. Even they said, the people who are writing it said he has many inaccuracies. This is the wanton immorality that Hermes is referring to. So This is when the Hamites, now do put your critical thinking caps on. We are now beginning to get a glimpse of who these people are that we're dealing with, according to the scholarship, right? Now, let's look at when the Hamites show up in Egypt under the Roman Empire. That was the Greek. Now let's look at with the domination of the Roman Empire. Now, I got this information from Eusebius, and he's considered the father of church history in book 1. And he states this: it was in the 42nd year of the reign of Augustus and the 28th after the conquest of Egypt. All right, here we go with the conquest of Egypt and the death of Antony and Cleopatra, that our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ was born in Bethlehem of Judea in accordance with the prophecies concerning him. The Romans awarded the government of the Jews to Herod, the first foreigner, appointed king of the Jews by Augustus and decree of the Senate, right? So here we have the Hamites again, and this arriving on this historical scene as a Roman. And they're appointing, they appointed a foreigner to the Jews who we all know were the Semites. So a foreigner means someone of a different race. So we can, when we take a critical examination at this information, we can come to the conclusion, I think, that your Herod was probably a Hamite as well, Hamitic. And as we go on into the study with Pastor Thomas Odimba, we're going to see how these Hamites have been the enemies of Israel since antiquity. Enemies. And some of us already know what Herod did, the decree, the genocidal decree, where he made the laws to murder all the infants in Judea, just like in Moses's time, when the decree went forth from the throne, the Hamitic king Ramses, or Seti I, which we're going to find out, to kill all the babies, the Hebrew babies. So, Jesus, he said, you shall know them by their fruit. And so they may have changed their names and whatnot, but if you look at their behaviors and their actions, you can identify who this clan and who this group is, right? So this was some interesting information that I wanted to bring out and recap about these Hamites and how Pastor Odimba brings to our attention about who they are and where they came from. Now Augustus, here's Augustus. He was a Rome's first emperor. That was Rome's first emperor. Okay, Augustus. So that was just a recap of some information that I really wanted to highlight and bring to your attention before we start the reading. Now, let us continue the reading. Chapter 3, the political life of Joseph, beginning on page 23. And as I've stated before, I will not be posting all the slides of the entire book, only the slides that I feel I would like to, that, grabbed my attention in a, as a student. And I want to make this clear that I'm a student, and these are just my notes that I want to share with you And this is not to take away from your own study and research. So please do your own research and your own studying as well. Bring your information to the table. Please post your comments because these are some of my notes that I've gathered that I would like to share with other students and other researchers. Now, in chapter 3, so I will not be posting everything, but just certain information that I find interesting. Now, in chapter 3, the political life of Joseph, and the subtitle is Joseph and Ben Azen, the Great Ramses. So it reads, the Bible and the Egyptologists agree on the fact that Joseph was not the only one to have been elevated by the Pharaoh in Egypt. Ben Azen, an Assyrian who came from a country that was located to the east of Lake Tiberade. This served Pharaoh a lot, but could not rise any further in the Egyptian society of the time because he was a descendant of Ham. In spite of this man, just like Joseph was able to occupy very responsible positions as the steward at the courtyard of the king and as the officer in charge of works, he stood, footnote 13, he stood at the right hand of Pharaoh as his fanfic carrier and washed the hands and the feet of his master. Pharaoh gave him the name Ramsey P. Ray and Ramses in the house of the king. His name had meaning in the Egyptian language. Ra stands for house, Amen means me, Ses refers to courtyard or land. All these put together means the caretaker of my courtyard of the king, or the janitor of the kingdom. Joseph was given the name Sapnath Pinak, and his wife Asnath, daughter of Putiphera, the high priest of On. Genesis chapter 41, verse 45. The next subtitle is The Arrival of the Israelites in Egypt and Their Settlement in Goshen, Land of Ramses. It was in conformity with the second vision of Joseph that Jacob, his wife Leah, and the 11 patriarchs went to Egypt. Joseph managed to settle his family on the land of Goshen, which the Egyptians had given to the descendants of Ham. According to the Bible, Jacob and his family did not go straight to the city where Joseph lived. The following verse sources throw light on this event. In Genesis chapter 46, verse 28, it reads, Israel sent Judah ahead to Joseph to lead the way before him into Goshen when they came to the land of Goshen. Genesis 47:1. So Joseph went and told Pharaoh, my father and my brothers with their flocks and herds and all that they possess have come from the land of Canaan. They are now in the land of Goshen. And in Genesis 47:27, thus Israel settled in the land of Egypt, in the region of Goshen, particularly distinguishing that it was the region of Goshen, and they gained possessions in it and were fruitful and multiplied exceedingly. It was thought that the decision to settle Joseph's family on this eastern part of Egypt over and above the descendants of Ham, who were already living in this land in large numbers, was because the Egyptians feared they were going to lose this land. It was on this land of Ramses that the Israelites will later suffer trials and tribulations in the hands of their former subjects, the Hamites. Genesis 9, verse 26. It was from this town that the Israelites finally departed, as was stated in Exodus chapter 12, verse 37. Quote, the Israelites journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot besides children. Exodus 33 verses 3 through 5 clarifies this further. The name Ramses said for this town should not be confused with Ramses I and II, the Hamite pharaohs who reigned 3 centuries later and were thus contemporaries of Moses. So Ramses I and II, the Hamite pharaohs, they reigned 3 centuries later, were the contemporaries of Moses. And Ben Azen or Ramses was the contemporary of Joseph. It can be observed from Genesis 47 and verse 11 and Exodus 1:11 that this name came from the Assyrian called Ben Azen, as mentioned earlier in this book, who was in charge of cleaning the king's hands and feet, and who the pharaoh named as Ramses Pire, Ramses. This was the man the pharaoh had initially entrusted the land of Goshen to in order to accommodate all his relations who came from the Near East, descendants of Ham. Ben Azen or Ramses was a contemporary of Joseph. The following text will clarify the difference between mainland Egypt and where Jacob and his descendants lived as overlords to the Hamites. It is stated in Psalm chapter 105:27 that, quote, they performed his signs among them and miracles in the land of Ham, end quote. In Psalm chapter 78, verse 51 enlightens us further, quote, he struck all the firstborn in Egypt, the first issue of their strength in the tents of Ham, end quote. Psalm 106, verse 22 also states that, quote, wondrous works in the land of Ham, and we some deeds by the Red Sea, end quote. It must be remembered that when the Israelites left the land where they were enslaved in Egypt, and which the descendants of Ham retook control of, they occupied Canaan, which also belonged to the descendants of Ham, as indicated in 1 Chronicles chapter 4, verse 40, quote, where they found rich, good pasture, and the land was very broad, quiet, and peaceful, for the former inhabitants there belonged to Ham. This is the next section, subsection, the death of the patriarchs. It reads, all the Jewish patriarchs who came to Egypt with Jacob died in Egypt and were buried over there by the Egyptians, Exodus 1 and 6. This was the case with Jacob too, who had received the honors reserved for pharaohs. The Egyptian doctors embalmed him for a period of 40 days, and the Egyptians mourned him for 70 days. Altogether, a total of 110 days of mourning all over the kingdom of Egypt. Genesis chapter 50, verses 1 through 3. This ceremony was not meant for slaves, nor for ordinary members of the nobles in Egypt. In Genesis chapter 50, verse 6 and 11, the Bible draws attention to the fact that Jacob was a king at this eastern part of Egypt called Mistra, which means the east or the rising sun. The Egyptians thus named his tomb Abel Misraim, which means, quote, father of the east or the king of the eastern province, Genesis 50 and 11. This was the case of all those who succeeded Jacob and who were close to Jacob and the Pharaoh. However, Joseph, just like all the pharaohs, was buried in a royal coffin. Genesis chapter 50, verse 26 states, quote, and Joseph died, being 110 years old. He was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt, end quote. Now, before we go any further, I want to give some information on this Ben Azen. So Ben Azen, and this is the individual that was contemporary, Ben Azen or Ramses, he was the contemporary of Joseph. It was Canaanite. This was his Egyptian name. He was in this is the 19th dynasty. and his title was cupbearer. So his position, his high position stationed next to the kings themselves, despite his foreign descent, he was a foreigner. Here it is, that word foreign, that allegedly should have restricted him to menial tasks. So this is why Pastor Odimba stated that because he was a descendant of Ham, so he was a cupbearer. So this is just some information, some background information. According to the inscription inserted to him, he had come from northern Jordan, thus he's referred to as Canaanite in terms of ethnic background. Like many butlers, a term coined to the officials of foreign descent in the Ramses area, Ben Azen reflects the Asiatic tone of the royal court head. So just this information, just confirming that he was indeed a cupbearer or a janitor of the kingdom, and that he was a foreigner, a Hamite, a Canaanite. Okay. So it continues on to read under the death of the patriarchs. Pastor Odimba, this is the political, chapter 3, political life of Joseph. Pastor Odimba goes on to state that when we link this era to that of Moses, we would think that the Jews had lost the power that Joseph and Pharaoh had granted them at this eastern part of Egypt. The persecution of the Jews in Egypt took place during the reign of the Hamites, long after the death of all the patriarchs. The persecution in Egypt, he goes on to state, given what had taken place, it is difficult to simply consider the persecution of the Jews in Egypt as the confirmation of the prophecy of Abraham and thereby downplay the social political aspects of this era, which was recalled in the Song of Songs, in the scenario between Solomon, the Sulamite, and the officer from the royal regiment. Thanks to this chronicle, we can therefore know the duration of this persecution before the Exodus, its various stages, and the perpetrators of this terrible tragedy. Now, the beginning of the persecution, it reads, according to the biblical text, the persecution started at the time Moses was born. Now, I like the way he reminds us, according to the biblical text, the primary source. According to the biblical text, the persecution started at the time of Moses was born. Long before this time, the Israelites were living in peace and in prosperity in Egypt. The New Testament depicts this period in Acts of the Apostles, chapter 7, verses 17 through 20. It reads, but as the time drew near for the fulfillment of the promise that God had made to Abraham, our people in Egypt increased and multiplied, verse 18, until another king who had not known Joseph ruled over Egypt, 19. He dealt craftily with our race and forced our ancestors to abandon their infants so that they would die. At this time, Moses was born, and he was beautiful before God. For 3 months, he was brought up in his father's house. Now, this period was around the time of the 19th dynasty during the New Empire. It goes on to read. This is page 26, the Egyptians who persecuted the Israelites. It is worthy of note that 3 centuries later, all the people who came from Palestine and elsewhere were all called Egyptians. And I want to emphasize that. All the people who came from Palestine and elsewhere were all called Egyptians. At the time of the Black pharaohs, Hyksos and Joseph, the Semitic Egyptians were in the majority, while the descendants of Ham, who were in Egypt, were represented in the royal palace by the Assyrian called Ben Azen, later called Ramseum P. Re Ramses. The two people, Semites and Hamites, were clearly separated, and the racial and cultural tensions that existed finally culminated in a terrible persecution, which lasted for 4 centuries, starting from the new empire of Ramses I, the Assyrian. This new king antagonized the Israelites on purely political grounds based on the differences between the two Egyptian ethnic groups. So we want to pay attention to this information that Pastor Odimba is bringing out about the two people, the Black Semites and the Black Hamites. It goes on to read under the subtitle, The Persecuting Pharaohs on page 26. Pastor Odimba alerts us to the fact that, quote, the pharaohs who persecuted the Jews dominated this part of Egypt during the 19th dynasty as indicated earlier. They were of a different race from the Semites. The Hamites, who were composed of Canaanites, Assyrians, Jebusites, the Rahamites, the father of the Romans, and the Philistines. They took control of Egypt. It is possible that they took control of the great throne of Egypt, where the descendants of Joseph were settled, and imposed themselves on the land that Pharaoh had given to their ancestor, Ben Azen of the great Ramses, an Assyrian, and proclaimed the new empire in opposition to the old one. Okay, the next section is titled The Assyrians versus the Israelites, a Matter of Life and Death. So this should be, this is the wrong subtitle. Excuse me, I should have subtitled this, The Assyrians versus the Israelites, a Matter of Life and Death. I'll have to go back and change that. So it reads, it is quite disturbing to find God's chosen generation in the hand of its enemies over the years. This disturbance makes it difficult to really explain the persecution of the Jews in Egypt and the other torment that this people have experienced. It sometimes becomes necessary to find out who the traditional enemies of Israel and Egypt are. The Bible talks about the violence. The Bible talks about the descendants of Ham, which comprise of the Philistines, the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Rahamites, forebears of the Romans, to mention but a few. However, we often forget about the reference that the Bible makes to the Assyrians as the foremost persecutors of the Jews. The Bible talks about the violence the Assyrians wreaked on the Jews, the Black Semites of Africa, in the following passage. So here's the first time that he uses this language, I believe. He refers to them as the Black Semites of Africa. And this is some this is some groundbreaking information right here. I think this is the first time he uses this language, the Black Semites of Africa. In Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 28, you played the whore with the Assyrians because you were insatiable. You played the whore with them and you still were not satisfied, end quote. In Micah chapter 5, verse 6, they shall rule the land of Assyria with the sword and the land of Nimrod with the drawn sword. They shall rescue us from the Assyrians if they come into our land or tread within our border, end quote. The Assyrian, it reads, Pastor Odimba states, the Assyrian meant to oppress all the Jews in Africa by subjecting them to slavery, as was stated in Numbers chapter 24, verse 22, quote, yet Cain is destined for burning. How long shall Ashur take you away captive, end quote. The one responsible for the sufferings of the Jews is easily identified in the above Bible text. Who are the Assyrians? That's the next subtitle of this chapter. Pastor Odimba is quoted as stating this: according to the Bible, here it's that word again, according to the Bible, the Assyrians are the descendants of Ashur. Ashur is a descendant of Shem, who chose to live among the sons of Ham. His people thus mingled with the sons of Ham to form one people who were dominated by the children of Ham. In Genesis chapter 10, verses 6 through 16, the Bible shows his role among the children of Ham as the one who built Nineveh. Quote, the descendants of Ham, Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. The descendants of Cush, Seba, Havilah, Sabta, Rama, and Septica. The descendants of Rama, Sheba, and Dedan. Verse 8, Cush became the father of Nimrod. He was the first on the earth to become a mighty warrior. Verse 9, he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. Verse 10, the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, and Akkad, all of them in the land of Shinar. Verse 11, from that land he went into Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Kala, and Rezin between Nineveh and Kala. That is the great city. Verse 13, Mizraim became the father of Ludan, Anamin, Lehabin, Naphtulim, Mathrusim, Kasluhim, and Kaphtorim, from which the Philistines come. Verse 15, Torah, Canaan became the father of Sidon, his firstborn, and Heth. Verse 16, and the Jebusites, the Amorites, and the Girgashites. So continuing on, who are the Assyrians on page 27, Pastor Odimba states this, quote, the mixture of these two groups resulted in a people who had lost its initial character and its Semitic culture, and thus became the enemy of the people of God and the Egyptians. This people was only left with the Semitic history and name. It was principally a Hamitic group characterized by Hamitic morphology. And I thought about this, and this is me, this in red, this is what I'm thinking. I don't know, maybe some of you can let me know if I'm off on this analysis, but an example of what happened with the mixture between the Semitic Assyrians and the Hamitic people when they went to live among, he said they lived among the Hamites, and as a result, they were principally they became a Hamite group characterized by Hamite morphology. And the example I give is like Black folk who have Semitic, we have, as we know, critically and analytically, we have the Semitic cultural history, but due to illiteracy, we have mixed with the oppressor ideologically and are principally Hamitic, characterized by Hamite morphology, and thus have become enemies of our God. I don't know if you can follow me with that thought. This is how I kind of imagine this, what's taking place here. That the same way, you have these Uncle Tom tap dancing cooning Negroes who are, they don't know, some of them don't know that they are the Black Semites of Africa. that, due to illiteracy. And so, they've mixed. And so now they're on the side. They don't know who the enemy is and the enemies of our people are. And due to that, they now have become, they've changed. He says that they're principally Hamites. So Black folk, how you've seen them, some of these so-called Black folk who, you look at them, especially these, I don't want to call out names, but you know who I'm talking about. They just, to me, when I see them, I just shake my head, and I'm gonna leave it at that. Now, he goes on to read. Now, before I go into that, I don't want to get to that part yet. But he says that God, Pastor Odimba, he said God wanted to draw his people close to him. And he's talking about it was principally a Hamite group characterized by Hamite morphology, period. Then he states, God wanted to draw his people close to him, but their corruption was too persistent for some time. Ben Azen, or Ramses the Great, was elevated to the status of authority by the Egyptians because of his Semitic origins. Okay, this is information for all you Egyptologists and scholars out there research. You know where Pastor Odimba is, he's bringing this out. Because some of us already knew that, wait a minute, the Assyrians are Semites, but this is, he's bringing the clarification. He says that they elevated him to the status authority of the Egyptians because of his Semitic origins. However, his spirit was no more among the Semites. Just like some of our brothers and sisters today, they don't care about the demise of their people, of Black folk no more. They have this attitude, me and my foe and no more. I got mine, F you mentality. That's that their spirit is no longer with their people no more. He says that even though he had Semitic origins, his spirit was no more among the Semites. As an officer in the royal court, he represented all the people of Ham who lived in Egypt. Like the Supreme Court justices and all these politicians, Black politicians and stuff, they're representing Egypt. They're representing the conquering nation. I mean, if you look at it critically and analytically, interesting, isn't it? It says that he represented the people of Ham who lived in Egypt. He wasn't about his people no more. He wasn't about trying to represent the Semites. No, not no more. This is no. You're talking about generations. He said they had mixed. That's what he said, that they had mixed. And now he was morphologically, his status in the Egyptian royal court as a representative of the Hamites won him the solidarity of all the enemies of Israel. And just like, how they will rally these so-called white folks when they get a Black person on their side, they will rally, take you straight to the top of the pyramid, no pun intended, but they will. Once you, just like he said, that once you have status in the Egyptian, he said his status in the Egyptian royal court as a representative of the Hamite, they love to put a Black face on their policies. Will you put a Black face on their policies? Well, have you noticed that mostly all the commercials, the jingle in the background is always Black music? While they're selling you their ungodly products and commodities, but they'll put the Black man's music in the background to kind of put the stamp of approval on it. That's what was happening back then in the times of old. King Solomon said ain't nothing new under the sun. His status, Pastor Odimba said that he represented the Hamites, even though he was a Semite. But because he represented the Hamites, it won him the solidarity of all the enemies of Israel. Shaking my head. Now it goes on to read the political reasons of the conflict in Egypt, page 20. Oh, this should be page 27, excuse me. Quote, just like the Hyksos, Joseph did not get along well with the Hamites. Under the reign of Joseph, see the Hyksos, the Semitic Black kings, pharaohs. I hope you get picking this information up. I know we've heard this name down through the years in class and stuff. I remember one time I was in a class at the university and they said something about the Hyksos, and I was like, the Hyksos? I didn't know. I'm telling you, I didn't know nothing. But when they said Hyksos, for some reason my head popped up out of the books, and it was a Jewish professor too. And I said, Hyksos? And he kind of like, I don't know, the way he looked, it was like he knew something. You know, when you're the only Black in the class, they don't talk the way they would talk if you wasn't there. And I felt, I'm not sure, you know, but you know, you get this, I had a feeling that he didn't really want to go into it. But yes, now I know. The Hyksos, they were the Black Semitic kings, the pharaohs, the Black Egyptians, Semitic Egyptians. But anyway, just like the Hyksos, Joseph did not get along well with the Hamites. Under the reign of Joseph, the Canaanites were dispossessed of their economic resources and all their land to the east of Egypt, Genesis 47, verses 14 to 17. Joseph acted on the approval of the Hyksos pharaoh. The marriage of Ramses I, a Hamite, to the THEI princess, a Semite, the daughter of Amenophis III, gave rise to strong resentment from the Egyptians and the Hebrews. You see what she did? She did that. Footnote number 1. In any case, this marriage gave legitimacy to succession to the throne of Egypt to the descendants of Ramses I. And here you have a picture of Miss Queen T. I forgot to read this part, that at the ascension of Ramses I to power, Ramses I, the Hamite pharaoh, the new empire, was thus beneficial for the Hamites who had for quite some time been scorned by the Egyptians and the Hebrews. The latter have been settled in the land of the Hamites by Joseph and thus supplanted the Hamites from taking care of Pharaoh's flocks. And then it goes on to read, the marriage of Ramses I, a Hamite, to the THEI princess, a Semite, the daughter of Amenophis III, gave rise to strong resentment from the Egyptians and the Hebrews. Footnote 1. In any case, this marriage gave legitimacy to the succession to the throne of Egypt to the descendants of Ramses. Now here is, I got this from Wikipedia. Not this picture. I found this picture somewhere else online, but she was her father was a foreign origin. That's what now remember who's writing this. Now, the people who are behind the conquering nations, they are the ones that have the access to the historical narrative. So when they say a foreign origin, you know, you have to put our critical thinking and analytical thinking caps on. Due to the features of his mummy and the many different spellings of his name, which might imply that it was a non-Egyptian name in origin, okay? You see that? Non-Egyptian, because why? They don't know that there were Black Semitic Egyptians. Maybe they know, but they don't want you to know that. So that here it again, history being used as a formidable weapon. And that's why we are admonished to study, to show ourselves approved unto God, to do a detailed investigation and analysis of a subject or situation, especially by means of books. So it says here, some suggest that the Queen's strong political and unconventional religious views, that's interesting, might have been due to not just a strong character, but to foreign descent. And we you have to look into that. We know already what that means, foreign descent, okay? Now, continuing on in chapter 3, Pastor Odimba states this: Seti the first, the son of Ramses the first, that he had with his first Hamite wife. Now, put your listening ears on. You have to really pay attention. Seti the first, who was the son of that Ramses the first, had with his first Hamite wife, who succeeded his father, was also a stranger or Hamite to the Egyptian throne. The strong opposition to his reign in Egypt made him enter into an alliance with his half-brother Ramses II, aged 11 years, but who by virtue of the lineage of his mother, the Queen of THEI, he calls her the Queen of THEI, Pastor Odimba, the Queen of THEI, and the second wife, so she was his second wife, the second wife of Ramses I, had given him legitimacy to the throne. Probably it was Seti I who was the great persecutor and who imposed the cattle worship in the whole of the eastern Egypt and broke the link between Upper and Lower Egypt. So he was the pharaoh that refused to recognize the authority of Joseph and that of his descendants in Goshen. And it was because, now this is interesting, it was because of him that the name Seti remained in the Jewish history and tradition as that of Satan. Wow. Seti and Satan, because he is the one who persecuted the Jews in Egypt. That's what he's saying. His analysis has brought him to that conclusion, Pastor Odimba. He said it was because of him. Now, the marriage between Ramses I and the THEI princess is considered as a strategy to infiltrate the Hamites into the succession to the Egyptian royal throne to supplant the Egyptian Semites. Here we go again. He's mentioning the Egyptian Semites, which we have never heard of in our readings and research prior to this information. This is breaking information and scholarship that's brought to the table. I know I had never heard of Egyptian Semites. To supplant the Egyptian Semites, who were the traditional heirs to the Egyptian royal throne. Okay, the next section is the origin of the pharaohs. It states, Pastor Odimba states, the Bible corroborates the opinions of Egyptologists who talked about the presence of foreigner pharaohs who persecuted the Jews. It identifies the origin of these pharaohs in Isaiah chapter 52, verse 4, quote, "For thus says the Lord God, long ago, my people went down into Egypt to reside there as aliens. The Assyrian, too, has oppressed them without cause," end quote. It goes on to read, while the Egyptians and the Hebrews were mingling with each other, the Assyrians, and when he says the Egyptians and the Hebrews, he's talking about the Semitic Egyptians, and the Hebrews we already know were Semitic. They were mingling. And he says the Assyrians and all the other people from Palestine were also forming an exclusive race within this country. This was going to lead to racial conflict between the two Semite and Hamite people who had the same pigmentation, but different morphological, and I have a slide for this, who had the same pigmentation, but different morphological cultural identities. Now, I looked up this word morphology. And, remember in the previous discussions, we were talking about how a word can have more than one meaning. Well, here's an example of that. And, oftentimes we have to look up words to see how it's being used and in the context, and that's a part of critical and analytical thinking and reading. So morphology, the third definition, is what I think, it fits for this context: a study of structure or form, the unique morphology of the city. So different structure and form culturally, Hamites, that we have where it's the same color, but we have a different structure and form culturally, and we're going to see, cranially and physically. And culturally, this is me, I'm saying opposing ideologies. That's another discussion. But, I'm coming up with these, based on the information and the research that I'm doing, I'm seeing that it's, a clash of cultures, and all culture have an ideology. And so it's something that the Semitic and the Hamitic people, they clash because of this. Pastor Odimba, he states, because of the morphological cultural identities. Different. The same pigmentation, but different morphological cultural identities. Okay, they have different belief systems and practices. All right. Now, here's example of this physical morphological difference. Now, in Numbers chapter 13:33, Pastor Odimba draws our attention to this scripture where it says, "There we saw the Nephilim, the Anakites come from the Nephilim, and to ourselves we seemed like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them." Now, the word Anak in the Bible dictionary means long neck. And so we know that a lot of us may be not familiar, but Iman, she's one of the most famous and successful high fashion models in the world. And this is a portrait of her. She is Somali. I think she's either Ethiopian or Somalian, but they're the same family. But you can see the neck, the long neck. Okay. And this is is in the museum in Berlin, the daughter of Akhenaten. And you can see the similarity. So this is I don't think it gets any more clear than that. The difference between the Semitic people and the Hamitic. Morphological structure and form. You can see the structure and the form here. Now, another, before we go on and continue in the reading, I want to, I found this information online as well. And, this is another example of how the conquering nations, how the way they say things. Now, look, This is in Discover, and the title of the article was The Genetic Affinities of Ethiopians. All right, and I'm just going to read it, and I don't want to say, I'm not going to make any comments. I'm just going to read it, and I want you to answer this question. What's not being said? After all the information that we have gathered so far, I'm not going to give you the answer. I want you to think about what's not being said. Now, this is Ethiopia, right? Now, it says here, in the open thread, someone asked, quote, any recent stuff on the genetics of Ethiopians? That prompted me to look around because I'm curious too. Poking around Wikipedia, I couldn't find anything recent. A lot of the studies are older, uniparental lineage-based works, NRY and mtDNA. Ethiopia is interesting because unlike almost all other sub-Saharan African nations, it has a long written history. You see that? Okay. Now I'm going to pretend like, but anyway, culturally and linguistically, it has both sub-Saharan African and non-sub-Saharan African affinities. So I just have to say this, that when they talk about, so some of us may not know, but when they say sub-Saharan, I was going to say that word, sub-Saharan Africa, they're talking about Negroes, right? Now, non-sub-Saharan affinities. Don't you love the way she said that? They have both sub-Saharan or Negro and non-Negro African affinities. The languages of Highland Ethiopia are clearly Semitic. Those of lowland Ethiopia are Cushitic, a branch of the broader Afro-Asiatic language family concentrated around the Horn of Africa. Somali is a Cushitic language, though most Ethiopian nationals who speak a Cushitic dialect are of the Oromo group. And this was written by your Razib Khan, January 10, 2011 at 2:04 p.m. Now, so, I mean, put your critical and analytical thinking caps on. I'm not going to say anything. I'm just going to leave it to the reader to see if you can see what I see. Do you read what I read? Anyway, now, Origin of the Pharaohs is the next section under the subsection of the political life of Joseph. And the Bible, it reads this, that the Bible corroborates the opinions of Egyptologists. I'm on page 28, so I haven't gotten to this part yet. The Bible corroborates the opinions of the Egyptologists who talked about the presence of foreigner pharaohs who persecuted the Jews. Oh, I already read that part. It identifies the origin of these pharaohs in Isaiah chapter 52, verse 4. While the Egyptians and the Hebrews were mingling with each other, okay, I read that. I'll just read it again. The Assyrians and all the other people from Palestine were also forming an exclusive race within this country. This was going to lead to racial conflict between the two Semite and Hamite people who have the same pigmentation but different morphological cultural identities. It is possible to say that it was the Israelites themselves who compromised the throne of Joseph that was inherited by Ephraim to the descendants of Ramses, because having enjoyed protection under the old empire, the Egyptians left them at the mercy of the new lords, the Hamites. And so they fell with the old empire. Paul, the apostle of Jesus Christ, bore testimony to this in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 7, verse 19. Quote, he dealt craftily with our race and forced our ancestors to abandon their infants so that they would die, end quote. Now, it is on page 29, it is necessary to emphasize that from the time of Noah racial differences were not determined on the basis of the color of the skin, but by lineage in relation to Ham, Shem, and Japheth. I thought that was very important and significant that Pastor Odimba brings that out, to point that out, that it's not about the color of your skin. It wasn't about the color of your skin. It was about your lineage. And the people of antiquity, they knew their lineage. And even today, you know, America, what's going on here, the nonsense that's going on here, for the most part, is not going on in other parts of the world. But people know the differences between, they know who is who and what's what. Just like me, I can speak from my personal experience. When I see an Ethiopian or a Neolithic person or a Somalian, I immediately know that they're not the same as us. It's not rocket science. So they might have the same color, but I know that we are not the same. And it wasn't until I started getting into research and studying, and I started to understand why. Now, he also states that this is because the three lineages have the same complexion, which could only vary due to climatic differences or geographical location. In the first two lineages, it is possible to find differences in complexion in these first two lineages, Ham and Shem. This is how come we have dark-skinned Semites and light-skinned Semites. The same situation applies to the Hamites as well. The Hebrews, just like the Egyptians and other people who sojourned in Egypt during this era, had these characteristics, and the Egyptian figure up to the throne, up to the time of the escape from Jerusalem, talking about 70 AD. This can be observed in the ancient text, especially as far as Moses is concerned, as depicted in Exodus chapter 2, verse 19. They said, quote, "They said an Egyptian helped us against the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock," end quote. In the New Testament, the Roman soldier asked Apostle Paul, a Benjamite, in Acts of the Apostles, chapter 21, verse 28, if he was not an Egyptian, thus someone from the Black race. Quote, "Then you are not the Egyptian who recently stirred up a revolt and led the 4,000 assassins out into the wilderness?" End quote. Let us also note that this racial dichotomy between the Jews and the Philistines was also perceptible in Babylon, as expressed in the following biblical text. In Esther chapter 8, verse 6, quote, "For how can I bear to see the calamity that is coming on my people? Or how can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred?" End quote. And in chapter 10 of that same book, verse 3, quote, "For Mordecai the Jew was next in rank to King Ahasuerus, and he was powerful among the Jews and popular with his many kindred, for he sought the good of his people and interceded for the welfare of all his descendants." Now, the next section of Pastor Odimba's book, The Great Secrets of Israel, he goes into the chronology of the pharaohs who persecuted the Jews. Now, in the 19th dynasty, he has his chronology as being the 19th dynasty from 1320 to 1210 BC. The pharaohs during the 19th dynasty were Ramses I, 1320 to 1318, Seti I, 1318 to 1304, Ramses II, 1304 to 1237, and Merenptah, approximately about the time of 1236 to 1223. And he states that the Exodus took place under the reign of Merenptah, who allowed the departure of the children of Israel in 1223 BC, Exodus 1237 and 33, verses 3 through 5. However, the persecution and the war between Upper and Lower Egypt persisted all the time that these pharaohs ruled this part of Egypt. Their succession was as follows: Ramses, 1222 to 1217, Seti II, 1216 to 1210, and then the 20th dynasty from about 1200 to 1065 BC, Seth Neti, 1200 to 1198, Ramses III, 1198 to 1166, Ramses IV until the Ramses XI, 1166 to 1085. After the reign of Ramses XI, King David put an end to the new empire by entering into alliance with Simon, the pharaoh of Upper Egypt. This alliance made it possible to sack those who were referred to as the ungodly people and to rescue the Jews who remained in Africa, the Upper Egypt. And this is referenced in this reference here. Biblical predictions announced an attack launched by the Assyrians on the Jews of Africa. Numbers chapter 24, verse 22 reads, quote, "Yet Cain is destined for burning. How long shall Ashur take you away captive?" End quote. These were not the only enemies of the Jews, but they were also the instrument that God used to correct the Jews each time that the Jews failed to respect the principles of their sacred covenant with God. This is clearly expressed in Isaiah chapter 10, verse 5. Quote, "Ah, Assyria, the rod of my anger, the club in their hands is my fury," end quote. And I'm glad that he brought this out. I should have made a slide for this information, because these enemies, quote unquote, of God's people, he's pointing out, oftentimes were being used to correct the Jews for being disobedient or disloyal to their contract or the covenant, the legislation of Moses, the legislation that God gave to Moses. It goes on to read on page 31. Now, contrary to what we believe, this is subtitled The Exodus. Contrary to what we believe, the Exodus did not take off from the whole of Egypt. The operation that Moses led started from the eastern part of Egypt, the land of Ramses. Exodus chapter 12, verse 37, quote, "The Israelites journeyed from Ramses to Sukkoth, about 600,000 men on foot, besides children," end quote. This was the land that they had worked on as slaves for their new masters. We read from Exodus chapter 1, verse 11 that, quote, "Therefore they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built supply cities, Pithom and Ramses, for Pharaoh." The Bible also intimates that it was not all the Israelites that left with Moses. According to Deuteronomy chapter 29, verses 13 through 15, quote, "In order that he may establish you today as his people, and that he may be your God, as he promised you and as he swore to your ancestors, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob." Verse 14, "I am making this covenant, sworn by an oath, not only with you who stand here with us today before the Lord our God, but also with those who are not here with us today," end quote. Let us note that the Exodus did not put an end to the persecution. Some of the Israelites remained in Lower Egypt under Hamite domination and were thus subjected to this situation. The Egyptians and the Hebrews of the Old Empire who settled in Nubia and Ethiopia continued to fight the new empire that was installed by the Assyrians, the Hamites. This conflict continued up to the time of David, Israel, and Simon, the Nubian pharaoh of Upper Egypt. Pastor Odimba continues in the subsection, The End of the New Empire and the Persecution in Egypt. It reads, the Hamite dynasty was weakened with the arrival of the Smedes, who abandoned the ranks and ideas of Seti the Great in order to follow Ammon, and thereby created a new settlement in the town. It is possible that the Smedes was not of the same race as Ramses, or that he was simply an Egyptian that was born to mixed couple, just like Ramses II. This is because he had consistently toppled all the Hamite dignitaries. Footnote number 14. He reconstructed Avaris and the ruins of Pi Ramses Ben Azen by creating a new settlement in the town. His successors, Sunes, completed the construction of Tanis. The fifth king of this dynasty was Simon, the contemporary of David. This was the king who organized the extermination of all the Hamites together with David and then linked Egypt to Israel. Footnote 15. This achievement of the dreams of David raised him to the status of great prince of Israel, just like Joseph. His victory was crowned with two inverted pyramids that we call the Star of David, an Egyptian symbol of union between the two kings and their kingdoms, Egypt and Israel. According to Anthony T. Bolker's illustration, it is the Black pyramid which entered into the White pyramid, hence Egypt entered into Israel, footnote 16. This confirms the expression of the Sulamite in chapter 2, verse 9 and 17 of the Song of Songs. This alliance made it possible to rescue the rest of the Semitic people, Egyptians and Hebrews, who remained under the domination and the persecution of the Hamites in order to end the 21st dynasty in Egypt. It also marks the end of this Hamitic race that the Jews called barbaric people, Psalm 114 and Isaiah 33, verse 19. The Hamitic fugitives formed the kingdom of Saba to the north of Arabia. Others were dispersed towards the north of Isthmus in Crete, Arabia, Assyria, and Rome, far from the frontiers of Egypt and Israel. The duration of the real persecution is the next subtitle. Pastor Thomas Odimba continues, quote, it is worthy of note that the persecution of the children of Israel in Egypt began with the commencement of the new empire, which was during the era of the 19th dynasty in Egypt. This was between 1320 and 1200 when Egypt was under the domination of the new pharaoh. This was incidentally the time Moses was born. The time between the birth of Moses and the Exodus could be estimated to be 80 years. From the Exodus to the time of Solomon could be 320 years. In sum, one can talk about 400 years, and that corresponds to the prophecy of Abraham on the 4 centuries of persecution on the land which was not theirs, on a land which was theirs. Let us note that during the first 3 centuries in Egypt, before the beginning of the empire, the Jews lived in peace, and when noble people who were in charge of the flock of Pharaoh, Exodus 1, verses 6 through 7. 3 centuries later, it is possible to see that they have constituted a kingdom because Egyptians did not set up government as they have them today. They rather installed kings who had a special relationship with the pharaoh. The inscription of Ebal Misraim, father of the East or king of the East, on the tomb of Jacob calls to mind a power that was established on the territory. What is more important is the funeral ceremony that was organized for Jacob, as well as the inscription on his tomb. The Bible says in Genesis chapter 50, verses 1-4, quote, "Then Joseph threw himself on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. Joseph commanded the physicians in his service to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel. They spent 40 days in doing this, for that this is the time required for embalming. And the Egyptians wept for him 70 days. When the days of weeping for him were past, Joseph addressed the household of Pharaoh. 'If now I have found favor with you, please speak to Pharaoh as follows,' end quote. This funeral ceremony could not have been organized for a slave or an ordinary noble member of the Egyptian society. The Bible intimates later that the whole of Egypt attended the burial of Jacob. This ritual could only be the lot for those who had some power in the Egyptian social cultural environment. If we should relate the facts to the prophecy of this persecution, we would realize that it was another reign of Solomon that all the riches of Egypt were brought to Israel. However, apart from Joshua and Caleb, none of those who left Egypt with Moses arrived with the riches in Israel. During the era of Solomon, an intimate relationship was reestablished between the kingdom of Joseph and Israel. This was impossible during the new empire. This opening of the frontiers enabled the Jews, who had formed an important colony in Egypt, to pay regular visit to Israel, starting from the era of Solomon up to the fall of Jerusalem. 1 Kings 4-21. This alliance between Egypt and Israel, which was formed under the reign of Solomon by the use of the Song of Songs, which became the most sacred book of the whole Jewish tradition. This book is the subject of all discussion in this work. And he's talking about the Song of Songs of Solomon. From this era, the people of Israel were considered in a special way as described in certain 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verse 8, footnote 8. At that time, Solomon held the festival for 7 days, and all Israel with him, a very great congregation from Lebo Hamath to the Wadi of Egypt, end quote. Before undertaking to translate the Song of Songs according to the Jews in Africa, it is important to show to our readers the links that exist between the African Jews and the contemporary Israeli society. Okay, and so that's going to end the reading of chapter 3 for us today. And the next chapter we will read will be chapter 4, titled The Jews of Africa. And he's going to go into the people of Joseph specifically. And then the last chapter before he goes into the translation of the Song of Songs of Solomon will be chapter 5, the presence of the Jews in Africa after Solomon. Just a reminder that this presentation is being brought to you by Operation Isaiah 58 Biblical Literacy Institute, where we are reading critically as a righteous act, presenting you identity, empowerment, theology, self-discovery through a critical study of the scriptures. Peace and blessings to all who love the truth, and ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. Thank you for joining me. Hope to continue in your studies. Happy studies. Love you.